At 04:16 hours local time, a swarm of Ukrainian UAVs was flying low over the Black Sea, 40 miles from the coast of the Crimean Peninsula. Ahead of them was Vardies Airfield, a key strategic air base of Russia's aerospace forces in Crimea, which Moscow uses to control the Black Sea and support military operations in southern Ukraine. But what the Ukrainian control crews did not know was that after repeated attacks on Crimea, Russia had added a weapon here that no drone had ever faced before. And whether this attack would succeed would depend on a single decision by the UAV commander at the exact moment the Luty swarm entered Crimean airspace. After 45 minutes of flying through the darkness, the satellite receiver on the lead UAV updated its position. But the new position was wrong. On the control screen, the system showed the drone approaching the coast of Mikavka, but reality was completely different. It was flying at an altitude of 250 feet at 100 miles per hour and was heading toward the port of Sevastopol. This was the area with the most modern and densely layered air defense system on the peninsula. In the port area, Russia's Pol-21 began spreading interference over GPS, GLONASS and GNSS signals. It fed the drone a completely false position. A deviation of only a few miles could cause the entire formation to slide out of the attack corridor, miss the target, or fly straight into a Russian air defense zone that was already waiting. The UAV still believed it was on the right path, but in reality, it was being pulled away from the target inch by inch. But the AN-196 Luty was not built to trust those spoofed signals completely. Inside the UAV's body was an inertial navigation system. It calculated its own heading, speed, time, and distance traveled. It did not need to ask satellites where it was every second. It counted every step of its flight through the darkness by itself. Yes, this system still had errors. With every mile flown, the deviation could grow slightly. But a Vardies airfield was still on the Crimean Peninsula, and that margin of error was not enough to ruin the entire mission. It was like wanting to reach the Statue of Liberty once you were already in New York. There are many routes you can take. So when the satellite signals began to lie, the Luty did not panic. It kept flying and began using its autonomous AI mode to calculate a new flight path. Along the coastline near the port of Sevastopol, a Russian air defense officer from Crimea's 31st Air Defense Division was sweeping his search radar across a 40-mile radius over the sea. The signal appeared only faintly. Then it vanished. He leaned closer to the screen. A small trace flickered again for a few seconds, then broke apart as if swallowed by the background clutter on the water. Not clear enough to lock on, not certain enough to fire, but not empty enough to ignore. After 3 years of drone warfare, no Russian officer still believed that this kind of interference meant nothing was coming. A flickering signal could be more frightening than a clear target. If the radar could lock the target, the air defense crew at least knew where to fire. But when it appeared only in brief fragments and then disappeared, it meant something was closing in, and the system did not know exactly what it was or where it was. All along the defensive line around Sevastopol, other crews were staring at screens that were not completely empty either, just faint, broken traces of interference, appearing in one sweep and disappearing in the next. All of them were arriving at the same uneasy thought. Something was coming, and the radar could only see it a few seconds at a time. If you looked at one of the AN-196 Luty drones skimming just above the water, that ghostly screen started to make sense. It was a small long-range strike UAV built from composite materials and plywood, costing only $100,000 designed by Ukraine to make Russian radar doubt its own data. At an altitude of 250 feet above the sea, the Luty was hiding behind 2 layers of cover at the same time. The first was the constantly shifting surface of the Black Sea, creating countless chaotic reflections on the radar screen. The second was the curvature of the Earth. For a target flying that low, a ground-based radar could not see it from far away the way it could track an aircraft or missile at high altitude. In theory, the cruise radar could observe out to 250 miles if the target was high enough and clear enough. But now it could not track these objects even at a distance of 40 miles. The Russian operator was not bad at his job. This morning, the problem was that the laws of physics were not on his side. Then the distance began to close. The curvature of the Earth could no longer fully shield the UAV swarm. The faint signals from earlier began rising above the radar horizon. On the Russian air defense officer screen, the broken traces no longer disappeared as quickly as before. They stayed longer, grew brighter, and became clearer with every radar sweep. 15 minutes passed. When the Luty swarm was 15 miles from the coastal defense line, the radar screen gradually filled with small flickering points sich flow over the sea. Each point could be a real UAV. It could also be only clutter. But no one inside the command post dared to treat it as clutter. Then the formation began to split. One group headed towards Seki airfield. Another raced toward the ferry area across the Kerch Strait, the critical logistics connection between Russia and the peninsula. The main group turned toward Vardies airfield, where Russia positioned combat aircraft, technical depots, and maintenance facilities supporting operations in Crimea. That was when the interception system began to stretch to its limit. Each battery had only a certain number of fire control channels. Each channel could track and engage only one target at a time. Imagine a switchboard with only a few lines, but dozens of calls coming in at once. Every call could be real. Every call could be a decoy. With every interceptor missile launched, Russia's ammunition stock dropped by 1. With every cheap UAV shot down, they might be spending a missile many times more expensive than the target itself. But if they did not fire, even one Luty slipping through could hit an airfield, ferry terminal, fuel depot or pier. That was the whole problem. Ukraine only needed Russia's interception system to process too many targets at the same time. When radar had to classify too many signals, when fire channels were occupied, and when battery commanders had to choose which target to shoot first, the air defense system began to slow down. Throughout his career, the battery commander had been trained to fight fighter aircraft and cruise missiles. No one had ever trained him to fight pieces of plywood and composite, but he no longer had time to think. On the 50N6A radar screen of the S-350 Vityaz system, he scanned the engagement zone, selected the nearest group of signals, and gave the order to fire. 49 M96E missiles left the launchers almost one after another. They shot out from the coastal firing position, leaving white smoke trails tearing across the dawn sky. The fire control radar tried to hold target lock. The fire control computer calculated the meeting point. The missiles accelerated to Mach 3, climbed along their interception paths, and then dived toward the Luty, skimming just above the waves. It was a strange confrontation. A modern air defense system designed to protect the sky against cruise missiles and jet aircraft was now forced to hunt targets that were small, cheap, and flying so low they almost touched the sea. The first missile exploded in front of the formation. A column of water rose from the Black Sea, hanging in the dim morning light. The second detonated off to the right, its fragments sweeping across the water, but not close enough. The third detonated too early when its proximity fuse was confused by reflections from the waves. The fourth dived lower and exploded near one UAV, but the Luty punched through the wall of water and kept flying. But the problem was not range. The problem was the target. A Luty flying just above the sea did not create a clean image like a fighter jet. Its body was small. Its radar return was weak. Beneath it was a constantly moving surface of water, reflecting signals in thousands of different directions. To the radar, the UAV's body and the sea almost fused into one patch of clutter that was difficult to separate. The missile's proximity fuse had been built to recognize objects that were clearer, larger, and more stable. But this morning, it had to distinguish a small airframe flying close to the waves from an entire sea, screaming back false signals. Imagine an advanced home security system with cameras in every corner and sensors on every door, But the intruder is only a mouse running along the baseboard. The system still works, the sensors still activate, but everything has been calibrated for a much larger threat. That was the S-350 situation. Now, it could track targets at long range if those targets were high enough, clear enough, and clean enough from background clutter. But against a small UAV flying low over the sea at a distance of only a few dozen kilometers, everything became much more irritating. Not because the system could not see anything, but because it was seeing too many things at once. At the control panel, the picture grew heavy. Low-altitude signals flickered constantly inside the clutter. No target stayed stable long enough to become a complete picture. Meanwhile, the higher signals were clearer, brighter, and easier to lock, but many of them could be decoys or secondary targets inside the formation. He was winning the engagements the system allowed him to fight, but the number of bright points on the screen kept increasing. That was the full brilliance of Ukraine's tactic. They did not need every UAV to fly straight at the same target. They only needed to force Russia's air defense system to believe that every direction could be the most dangerous one. Once the formation split apart, the Russian air defense batteries were pulled apart with it. The radars in one sector could no longer easily support the radars in another. The air defense units could not easily reinforce one another either. The systems around Sevastopol were forced to keep staring at the flickering signals out over the sea. 8 AN-196 Luty broke away from the decoy formation, turned toward the northwest, and began pushing deeper into the Crimean Peninsula. Their target was now unmistakably clear: Vardies Airfield. Ahead of them lay Crimea's wide, low-steppe terrain, where Russia had built multiple layers of air defense to protect the peninsula. Long-range radar, electronic warfare stations, surface-to-air missile batteries, short-range anti-aircraft guns. Everything had been arranged to turn the approach to Vardies into a deadly corridor. But by that point, the system was no longer as intact as it looked on the map. Part of the radar network was busy tracking false targets. Part of the fire control channels was already occupied. Part of the missile inventory had already left the launchers to chase UAVs that the Russians could no longer confidently identify as decoys or real threats. The 8 Lutys flew straight into that gap. They were low enough, cheap enough, numerous enough, and patient enough to force one of the densest air defense networks in Crimea to disperse itself. And only when the main thrust turned toward Vardies did the Russians begin to understand the real problem. They were not just fighting UAVs. They were fighting the way Ukraine forced the entire air defense system to choose wrong before the real target even appeared. The 8 Luty drones continued flying northwest, crossing the low steppe plains of Crimea. From above, the terrain was exposed. No forest to hide beneath, no urban clutter to confuse sensors, only open fields and scattered Russian air defense positions. Then they entered the fire zone of Donskoye. 8 mil from Vardies Airfield, a Russian Pantsir-S1 system was already waiting. 5 minutes earlier, its crew had received warning data from the air defense network across the peninsula. On their screens, the low-flying targets were moving into the exact corridor they had predicted. This time, they were no longer broken fragments of interference on the radar. The Pantsir-S1's 1RS-21 radar began locking onto the targets. The tracking became steadier, clearer, and closer. At this range, the Luty was no longer protected by the curvature of the Earth. It had entered the distance where the Pantsir was built to fight. The battery commander gave the order to fire. 2 750E6 missiles left their launch tubes almost at the same time, blasting out and accelerating to Mach 3. They rushed straight toward the UAV formation, dragging 2 thin trails of smoke across the gray sky. The radar held the lock. The fire control computer calculated the intercept angle. At only a few miles away, the Luty drones had almost no time to react. The first missile closed in on the lead drone. Its proximity fuse detonated about 15 feet from the target. A flash of fire bloomed in midair. The Luty shattered instantly. its composite body and plywood frame torn into small pieces that fell across the steppe below. The second drone tried to turn away, but at that speed and at that distance the reaction came too late. The second 57E6 exploded beside it. Fragments tore through the UAV's body, ripping apart its wing and engine. It rolled sideways, lost lift, and plunged into the ground in a short trail of smoke. In just a few seconds, the formation of 8 had been reduced to 6. But the Pantsir's own problem began at that very moment. Missiles are highly effective when the target is still far enough away to track, calculate, and intercept. But as the remaining UAVs accelerated together and dropped even lower, the distance closed too quickly for the Russian air defense crew. Missiles were no longer the best option. If they kept firing, the reaction window would be too short, the firing angle too sharp, and the risk of letting targets through would grow with every second. The commanders switched combat modes. The two 30mm 2A38M automatic cannons rotated down toward the approach line. The barrels stabilized. The targeting system began pulling the aim point ahead of the UAV formation. Then the Pantsir opened fire. The sound ripped through the morning like a giant chainsaw. The two cannons spat out nearly 5,000 rounds per minute, building a wall of metal in front of the Luty drones. Tracer fire slashed across the air. Bursts of 30mm rounds cut through the flight path, slammed into the ground, and formed a dense curtain of fire between the UAVs and Vardies airfield. For the Ukrainian operators, the situation became clear immediately. If that wall of fire stayed in place, the 6 remaining Luty drones would never reach the airfield. They could not fly through a storm of rounds being adjusted in real time by radar and electro-optical sights. So a decision had to be made. One AN-196 Luty broke away from the group. It accelerated to its maximum speed of 130 miles per hour, dipped its nose, and charged directly toward the Pantsir-S1 position. Inside the cabin, the Russian crew saw the target change course too late. The cannons were still firing. The turret was still trying to drag the stream of fire back toward the drones approaching the airfield. The Luty punched through the edge of the barrage, its body shaking violently, sections of its wings being torn away, but its engine kept driving it forward. Then it slammed into the Pantsir-S1 system. An explosion erupted at the firing position. Flames swallowed the turret and the launch tubes. The 30mm barrage that had been cutting across the flight path suddenly went silent, as if someone had pulled the power from the entire defensive system. In the next few seconds, a gap opened. The 6 remaining Luty drones immediately accelerated, dropped lower, and raced through the Donskoye area before supporting forces could react. Behind them, smoke from the Pantsir-S1 rose above the steppe. Ahead of them, Vardies airfield had come within striking range. The Russians still refused to give up. As soon as the report that the Pantsir-S1 system at Donskoye had been hit reached the command post, the air defense commander at Vardies airfield understood that the final outer shield protecting the base had been torn open. The 6 remaining AN-196 Luty drones were now racing straight toward the runway, the hangars, and the technical zone of the airfield. He immediately grabbed the radio. 2 other wheeled Pantsir-S1 systems were ordered to move urgently into the hangar area to provide cover. But combat vehicles needed time to move and deploy. They needed time to rotate their radars, stabilize their turrets, and bring their systems into firing condition. And that was exactly what Vardies no longer had much of. While waiting for reinforcements, the commander ordered every weapon still capable of firing to be used. 4 Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns positioned inside the airfield opened fire at the same time. Their 23mm barrels shook violently, pouring bursts of fire at a rate of 1,000 rounds per minute toward the UAV's flight path. Tracer rounds ripped across the low sky, forming overlapping lines of fire above the airfield perimeter. On the outer belt, patrol soldiers raised Stupor handheld anti-drone guns onto their shoulders. They tried to suppress the control signal, cut the connection, and force the UAVs off course before they could reach their targets. The system attempted to sever control links and navigation signals through directional electronic jamming, targeting control, data transmission, and satellite navigation bands such as GPS, GLONASS, and GNSS. But it was already too late for that kind of defense. The Luty drones were no longer dependent on direct control. After passing through the jamming and spoofing zones, they had switched into autonomous AI mode, calculating their own flight paths, correcting their own trajectories, and driving themselves toward the target coordinates. Then the heavy machine guns joined in. Quad-barrel Yak-B 12.7 mounts swung upward, their 12.7mm barrels spinning into a blur before opening fire. With a rate of fire of up to 4,000 rounds per minute, they sprayed dense streams of fire into the sky. The sound of machine guns, 23mm cannons, warning sirens, and UAV engines merged into one chaotic roar as if the entire airfield were being ripped apart from the inside. The soldiers on duty no longer waited for clear orders. From guard posts, from the technical buildings, and from the edge of the runway, they fired their AK-74s wildly into the sky toward the dark shapes rushing in. Some of them could not even see the targets. They were simply firing in the direction of the tracer rounds. Others caught a glimpse of the UAVs for only a few seconds before losing them behind hangar roofs, light poles, or the grey morning sky. The sky above Vardies turned into a chaotic battlefield. 23mm rounds burst and cracked in the air. 12.7mm rounds carved long streaks of light across the sky. Rifle fire shot upward like rain falling in reverse. Hot metal fragments dropped onto the runway, sparking against the concrete while the warning sirens continued to howl across the base. But the 6 AN-196 Luty drones had no other choice. If they slowed down, they would be torn apart. If they flew straight for too long, they would be pulled into the curtain of fire. If they turned too wide, they would miss their targets. So they did the only thing left: accelerated, dropped lower, and kept changing course. One drone banked slightly left, then suddenly corrected. Another dropped close to the ground, crossing the edge of the runway like a black shadow sliding beneath the gunfire. A third popped up for a few seconds, just enough to make the gunner pull his barrel away from the firing point. They did not fly cleanly. They did not fly straight. They did not fly like anything in a training manual. They flew like targets that understood every second of survival could be traded for an explosion inside the airfield. As the 6 AN-196 Luty drones began their final dive into the airfield area, a stray round from the ground fire net sliced directly into the body of the UAV on the left side of the formation. The drone flashed for a split second. Then the warhead inside detonated in mid-air. A fireball burst open in the low sky. The shockwave threw fragments of composite, plywood, and light metal outward like black rain above the edge of the runway. For that moment, the Russians believed they had started to regain control of the situation. Then the next drone was hit in the wing. Its body tilted sharply to one side. The engine was still pulling it forward, but its lift had become unbalanced. The Luty staggered through the gunfire, dipped downward, and fell out of formation like a bird with its spine broken. The Russians thought they could stop the attack. They were wrong. The drone with the damaged wing did not fall for nothing. It plunged straight into the runway area. Only seconds later, its 150-pound warhead detonated on the concrete surface. The explosion produced a white-yellow flash, followed by a violent pressure wave that slammed along the runway. At the center of the blast, the instantaneous pressure exceeded 50 atmospheres in the first moment, enough to crush the surface concrete, bend reinforcement layers, and blast earth and debris out from beneath the pavement. A large crater opened on the runway, roughly 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep. Hot chunks of concrete shot upward, then fell like hail across the takeoff and landing zone. The 4 remaining Luty drones still did not stop. They raced through the smoke, past the tracer lines stretching behind them, and turned one by one toward the military hangar area. This was where Russia gathered, stored, and prepared Shahed attack drones before sending them into operations against Ukraine. The first drone slammed into the outermost hangar. Its warhead detonated inside the enclosed space and inside a hangar. An explosion does not spread outward the way it does in open air. The pressure is trapped. It rebounds off the walls, strikes the floor, and slams into the roof. In the first instant, the shockwave can generate pressures above 30 pounds per square in near the blast center, enough to blow metal doors away, tear open roof panels, shatter glass, destroy light equipment, and throw every unsecured object across the structure. The hangar roof bulged upward, as if punched from inside by a giant hand. A column of fire burst through the torn roof, rising 170 feet into the air, carrying black smoke, metal fragments, and burning material with it. Temperatures inside the fire zone exceeded 1000 grad Celsius, hot enough to make thin steel frames glow red, ignite electrical wiring, destroy electronics, and trigger secondary fires inside the storage area. The second drone crashed into the neighboring hangar. This time, the explosion reached an area where fuel, lubricants, and UAV components were being stored. The flames did not simply erupt. They spread. A burning line ran across the floor as if someone had poured fire over the concrete. Small containers began exploding one after another, creating short, sharp secondary blasts that followed the main detonation, like a chain of steel hammers striking the air. The hangar doors were blown off their rails. Part of the sidewall collapsed. Thick black smoke crawled outward, dense enough to swallow the glow of the warning lights across the airfield. The third drone struck the third hangar. The blast lit up the entire area in a single breath. If the first two explosions tore the hangars open, this one turned its target into a furnace. Giant fragments, engine parts, wings, composite shells, and ground equipment were pulled into a mixed firestorm. The temperature rose so quickly that paint on nearby metal surfaces began to peel away. Windows in adjacent buildings shattered. The pressure wave slammed into technical vehicles parked nearby, shaking them violently before tipping them over or setting them on fire. The final Luty carried out the most important task. It aimed straight at the maintenance and repair zone, the area holding technical equipment, spare parts, ground support vehicles, auxiliary fuel tanks, power units, air compressors, and aircraft servicing systems. When the last UAV came down, the first explosion tore through the technical area. Then fuel, oil, compressed gas cylinders, and flammable materials began reacting. A massive column of fire rose straight into the sky, reaching 350 feet high, bright enough to reflect off broken glass and metal surfaces across the airfield. Temperatures in the main fire zone exceeded 1000 degrees Celsius. While the spreading radiant heat was strong enough to force nearby soldiers to retreat or throw themselves flat against the ground, a column of black smoke rolled above Vardies like a slow-burning mushroom cloud. Within seconds, the gunfire began to fade. In the sky, the drone formation had disappeared. On the ground, the runway had been gouged open. 3 hangars were burning. The maintenance zone was engulfed in flames. Fire and rescue routes were blocked by wreckage, thick smoke, and secondary explosions. Vardies airfield was not defeated by a single blast. It was torn apart by 6 final decisions unfolding in less than a minute beneath a sky full of gunfire and over an airfield that no longer had enough time to save itself. From a military perspective, the strike on Vardies was not just a successful UAV raid. It was an attack on Russia's ability to conduct war from Crimea. Ukraine struck directly at the air logistics chain. With the runway damaged, 3 hangars burning, and the maintenance zone hit, Russia lost more than Shahed UAVs. It also lost support equipment, spare parts, fuel, technical vehicles, and the ability to prepare aircraft for future missions. For a forward air base, this kind of damage is far more serious than the number of destroyed assets alone. The attack exposed the weakness of Russia's air defense network in Crimea. Russia had radar, Pantsir-S1 systems, Su-23 guns, heavy machine guns, anti-drone rifles, and infantry fire on site. But when forced to deal with multiple low-flying UAVs approaching from split directions, operating autonomously, and closing in within a very short time window, that system became overloaded. This shows that Russian air defense can still be strong in individual layers, but becomes vulnerable when the entire network is forced to react at the same time. Vardies airfield is part of Ukraine's broader strategy to isolate Crimea. Ukraine is not only attacking air bases, it is striking airfields, UAV storage sites, substations, logistics routes, and energy infrastructure in order to turn Crimea from a secure rear area into a zone of constant attrition. When electricity is disrupted, water supplies are limited, bases are forced onto backup power, and repair units are stretched thin, Russia's ability to support the southern front weakens as well. The final strategic meaning lies in the message. Crimea is no longer a place where Russia can safely store UAVs, maintain aircraft, and coordinate long-range airstrikes. After Vardies, Russia may still repair the runway and rebuild the hangars, but it will have to disperse its forces, reinforce air defenses, consume more resources, and accept that every base on the peninsula can become a target. In other words, Ukraine did not just damage an airfield. It slowed the tempo of Russia's long-range strikes, exposed the overload inside Crimea's air defense network, and continued tightening the campaign to isolate the peninsula. And the final question is this. After Vardies, where will the next target in the campaign to isolate Crimea be? Which part of the strike do you think mattered most? Damaging the runway, burning the Shahed hangars, or exposing the weakness of Russian air defense? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video useful, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to follow the next battlefield analysis. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.